And this is true. We love to do the things that we're not supposed to do. We don't need robbing, stealing, or mugging. In fact, don't take it seriously. We're only bugging.
What's up, Doc?
Heavy hitter. Sucker.
That was fresh. That was fresh. That was fresh. That was fresh.
Party people's in the place. We want you all to see that we can be taken seriously. But if you don't believe that, then forget you all. Cause we're gonna party hardy and have a ball. Cause we're here to prove through bugged out means that things aren't always what they seem. We want you all to scream and start to shout as we go on a mission and bug on out. Whistle, and this is true. We love to do the things that we're not supposed to do. We don't mean robbing, stealing, or mugging. In fact, don't take it seriously. We're only bugging. Well, it's all about us, Jazz and KD. But sometimes it's all about just me. You know what I notice all of a sudden? When I speak, people this ear button. There's not another person who sounds like me. Indubitably, there will never be. I'll say a tongue twister like the blink of an eye. Say it so well, you would think it's a lie. Like Peter Parker picked up his gold pen, put it on the back sale, then pursued his friend. His plot deployed, the polluted front persisted to prohibit, so the plot is plan flunk. My problem with plenty people who flee is blame the proper part without a picture of me. And my present play procrastinates my plea, so I'm the perfect pacemaker, perpetrated praise me.
Tell me, girl, now is it true that you love for me just to talk to you? For you to be my girl and I'll be your man. You be mine, not just another fan. You'd be with me everywhere I go. You'd hold my hand at every show. Inseparable is what we'd be. Jazz and Jazzette eternally. But after all of this, you know the dream would end. I wouldn't talk to you, I'd talk to your friend. And you would call me conceited and you call me wrong. But you'd call me that night and try to turn me on. And you dial my digits in the day or late at night. Promise and swear that you do me right. But I doubt that anything that you do would ever give me the stomach to talk to you. Now I'm bugging. In order to impress, but DJ Silver Spinner is really funny. He got tricks up his sleeves, and if that isn't enough, grab a front row seat and check out this.
When the place gets hot and the air gets thinner,
The mutilator on the tables is the silver spinner.
your scratch is fascinator, so why don't you reveal it?
Make it hard enough so everybody can feel it.
And this is true. We love to do the things that we're not supposed to do. We don't need robbing, stealing, or mugging. In fact, don't take it seriously. We're only bugging.
Let's learn about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was an American preacher, humanitarian, and activist who is best known for his role in the African American civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Dr. King, who was inspired by his faith and the peaceful teachings of Mahatma Gandhi, is considered one of history's greatest champions of nonviolence. He used the power of his words, as well as peaceful demonstrations such as protest, sit-ins, and boycotts, in an effort to achieve equality for all people. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is a true American hero. Let's learn more about his life and how he inspired a nation and the world to become more tolerant and accepting of all citizens, regardless of race, class, or gender. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on Tuesday, January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia at 12 p.m. His name at birth was Michael King. His father, also named Michael, changed both their names to Martin Luther in honor of the world-renowned German reformer of the same name. Martin Jr. was a middle child. He had an older sister named Willie Christine King and a younger brother named Alfred Daniel Williams King. Martin Jr. attended Booker T. Washington High School and was so smart he skipped both the 9th and 12th grades. He enrolled in Morehouse College at age 15 without formally graduating from high school. During his final semester at Morehouse College, Martin was ordained as a minister. He also took his first steps towards being an activist by writing a letter to the editor of the Atlanta Constitution. In the letter, he declared that African Americans were entitled to the basic rights and opportunities of American citizens. After graduating from Morehouse, Martin attended Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania from 1948 until 1951. Martin then began his doctoral studies at Boston University. During this time, he began to draw from his education, his faith, and his natural verbal ability to form the foundation for what would become his critical role in the civil rights movement. While in Boston, Martin met and dated Coretta Scott, who was a student at the New England Conservatory of Music. On June 18, 1953, they were married in Alabama, where Coretta's family lived. Martin and Coretta became the parents of 4 children: Yolanda King, Martin Luther King III, Dexter Scott King, and Bernice King. On December 1, 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give her seat to a white person on a crowded bus in Montgomery, Alabama, a city known for its segregated public spaces. That night, Martin met with other activists to plan a citywide protest that would become known as the Montgomery Bus Boycott. The boycott lasted over 380 days. During this time, Martin was arrested and harassed by people who did not want the changes he was fighting to bring about. The boycott, however, was a success. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation in transportation was unconstitutional. Martin's role in the boycott transformed him into a national figure and the best-known spokesman of the civil rights movement. In the wake of the boycott victory, civil rights leaders recognized the need for a national organization to better coordinate their efforts. In January of 1957, Martin and roughly 60 other ministers and activists founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC. With Martin as president, the SCLC helped conduct nonviolent protests and demonstrations across the South to promote civil rights reform. A primary focus for the organization was registering African Americans to vote. The SCLC sponsored mass meetings in key Southern cities for that purpose. In 1963, Martin led a coalition of several civil rights groups in a nonviolent campaign aimed at Birmingham, Alabama, which was at that time described as the most segregated city in America. The nation was shocked to see images of young African Americans attacked by police dogs and high-pressure fire hoses displayed on television, newspapers, and magazines. It was during this campaign that Martin wrote his now famous Letter from a Birmingham Jail after being arrested again for his participation in the demonstrations. Later in 1963, Martin was one of the driving forces behind the March for Jobs and Freedom, more commonly known as the March on Washington. On August 28, 1963, over 250,000 people of all ethnicities gathered at the National Mall in Washington, D.C. to demand justice and equality for all people. It was here that Martin made his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Delivered from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, this speech inspired the nation and is now considered one of the greatest in American history. Martin was later named Time magazine's Man of the Year. This further cemented his status as the nation's foremost social change leader. In 1964, at 35 years old, Martin became the youngest person ever to win the Nobel Peace Prize. When he found out that he had been selected, he promised to donate the prize money, over $54,000, to help continue the important work of the civil rights movement. He delivered another powerful speech when he accepted his award that was both moving and motivational. Also in 1964, partly due to the March on Washington and Martin's speech, Congress passed the landmark Civil Rights Act. This legislation made it illegal to discriminate against people because of their race. The Jim Crow rules of the South that promoted segregation and the harsh mistreatment of African Americans were now against federal law. This was one of the greatest accomplishments for the civil rights movement. In March of 1965, Martin led a march from Selma to the Capitol building in Montgomery, Alabama, to urge President Lyndon B. Johnson and his administration to pass a law protecting the rights of African American voters. At the conclusion of the march, Martin gave another powerful speech that helped rally more supporters. That same year, Congress went on to pass the Voting Rights Act that eliminated the remaining barriers to voting for African Americans. Prior to this legislation, there were still areas in which African Americans were completely disenfranchised, meaning they did not have the right to vote. Over the next 3 years, Martin's focus shifted from racial discrimination to economic injustice and international peace. He led campaigns in Chicago, Illinois, and spoke strongly against the Vietnam War. Martin's opposition to the war cost him support among white allies, including the president, union leaders, and publishers. Martin and the SCLC also organized the Poor People's Campaign in 1968 in an effort to assemble a multiracial coalition of poor Americans who would advocate for economic change. On April 4, 1968, Martin was shot while standing on the balcony outside of his hotel room at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. At 7:05 p.m., Martin was pronounced dead at St. Joseph's Hospital. He was 39 years old. Martin was buried in his hometown of Atlanta, Georgia. Dr. Martin Luther